Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 178. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Jessica Hatch about her new novel, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days. This fun rom-com story is a second-chance romance about a couple in the middle of breaking up who find themselves having to pretend to be in love with each other for a little while longer. Along with the main characters, Lena and Brown, the book features a cast of characters that is loosely based on a group of friends Jessica met when they all lived in the same old building. Jessica admits that writing How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days was a messier creative process than she is accustomed to, due to the quick deadline she had to meet in order for this book to make it onto the shelves. That's because her debut novel was released only 6 months prior. In this episode, I'll chat with Jessica about her writing journey, her experience with writing under pressure, and why she describes her writing style as too many books, too little time, as well as a few other things coming up. Jessica Hatch, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Stacey, thank you so much for having me. Apparently, I'm in the 3-timers club.
You are. You appeared on the podcast a long time ago now, talking about the editing process for us because your background is as a book editor.
Mm-hmm.
Then we talked not too long ago about your first novel, which was My Big Fake Wedding.
Yes.
And that was a fun conversation. So today you're back to talk about your newest novel, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days. So maybe start us off by telling us a bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. And it's great to be back. So How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days is the story of this couple, Lena and Brown, who are in the middle of breaking up. But then they find out that the building that they lived in when they met and where they met a great group of friends is being bought and torn down for luxury condos. And their friend still runs the building. They're like, we can't have this happen. So as they join the campaign to save the building, their relationship and all that happened to them in the building becomes a huge part of the campaign. And they start finding themselves having a second chance at parsing out where they went wrong and whether or not they want to stay together. And there's a lot of fun moments of them faking still being in love and then gradually trending towards still being in love. A lot of like red light, green light sort of situations where they'll be hashing out an argument, but then friends come around the corner, so they have to act all lovey-dovey. Fun things like that. It's basically like if the gang from The Big Chill were trying to save the neighborhood from the Goonies. It was a lot of fun to write. And what inspired me is just, we talked a little bit about the process of writing and the container of time in which you write. This book had a much shorter timeline from first draft to publication than my first book because of having a 2-book deal with Bookshop, my publisher. And so I think I was inspired a lot by true life. Some true life hooks. Luckily my husband and I have never had to fake still being in love while in the process of getting divorced. That is not true. But we did live in a building in downtown Jacksonville where we met a fantastic group of people who are friends to this day. And we had these lovely, what we called progressive dinner parties with them, where we would hop from apartment to apartment in the building and have a different course in each one. And those sorts of events frame the backbone of the book. So that was a major source of inspiration.
Let's talk about a lot of those things. First, let's talk about setting.
Yes.
Because even in rom-coms, setting becomes important. For example, the building that you lived in, inspiration for the building in your book. But let's talk about your selection for setting and how you place your characters in these quirky situations. Like, how did you decide what settings to use?
Absolutely. So I'd like to start by saying that temporal setting, or the use of time and timeline in this book, is pretty important to the storytelling. It's not one of those novels where necessarily every other chapter is the present and the past, but there are a few different inserts of flashbacks to the past, which inform, the happier past that the couple has had, the origins of the rift that's come between them, and then, the present where all of this, the causes are now leading to these effects. I mentioned the building, which is frankly almost like a character in and of itself. It provides the setting for a lot of the more bottle episode elements of this novel. If you're not familiar, or your listeners aren't familiar with the term, a bottle episode is like a TV show episode where everything takes place in the same apartment or office or whatever. And that's very much the case here. I think it's a trope, which I think we spoke about a bit. Romance loves to use tropes and turn them on their heads. And here I was playing around with forced proximity. If this couple didn't have the forced proximity of going back to the building that they once lived in, they demonstrate, they set up what they call a live-in to try to bring attention to the building's situation. If they weren't forced into that proximity with each other, who knows if they'd, give each other the time to have this conversation and potentially change the way their relationship is breaking apart. And then I just also want to say, I talked a bit about how my big fake wedding was set in my childhood hometown of Richmond, and Richmond is sort of a character in that book. Really, that novel is a love letter to Virginia. And then I feel like How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days is more of a love letter to Jacksonville, Florida, which I believe you and I have in common. Mm-hmm. And there's just a lot of elements of setting the tone of downtown as this still rough around the edges, but up and coming kind of place.
You mentioned the flashbacks that you included in your novel.
Yes.
Are you the kind of writer who writes all of that backstory first and then weaves them into the story as it's necessary? Or do you write the flashbacks, the backstory, just as you come upon it, writing out the sequence of the novel?
So I have two answers to this question: the ideal answer and the practical answer. Ideally, I have an outline of how the book will go. And so while I might write the chapters in order, I have a sense from that outline of, okay, here's what their past looked like. This was a relatively straightforward past, but if it was a bit more complex, I probably would have, charted that out before I even embedded it into the outline and scattered it throughout. But the base of my answer for both ideal and practical is that it starts with an outline. Practically speaking, with the drafting of How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days, the first draft was written at breakneck speed for me. I had a very busy work schedule while that first draft was being generated in the spring and early summer of 2022. So instead of doing that thing that I think writers usually can do if they're working off an outline and just going, this chapter is kind of boring, but I'm going to muddle through and I'll zhuzh it up later. To keep myself motivated, I had to go through the outline and go, what am I most excited to work on today? And just focus on that chapter. And so a lot of the work in the revision process was smoothing those transitions and figuring out, this thing that happened in the past actually has a bigger influence on the current argument they're in than I thought, etc. So it was more of a messy creative process than I'm used to, but I loved it. The main character, Sorry, I feel like I'm talking your ear off.
Not at all. It's good.
The male main character, Brown, like my husband, is a bartender, and I think the best analogy would be a high-end craft cocktail bar versus a high volume, just slinging well drinks and beers and wines kind of bar. Typically, I love that more sedate craft process where, oh, we put the proverbial house-made bitters into the drink and it's just gorgeous and the presentation is slow and the music is calm and lovely. But this was definitely more of the like, there's limes on the floor and there's a huge beer spill, but we're not going to get to clean that up until close, like that sort of thing. This was definitely like the creative process for this was a high volume bar situation.
Do you think you'll keep that process? Or was that sort of a one-off because of the time frame within which you were working?
I'm really proud of the fact that I know I can create under that sort of constriction. And one of my writing mentors, Chelsea Hodson, will tell you that constriction and constraint is a great tool for creativity. With that being said, I don't think that much time constraint is my favorite way to write. So I might guest bartend in the high volume bar sometime again in the future, but I much prefer my craft cocktail way of doing things.
What was the difference time-wise for you? How much time are we talking for you to get that first draft and then it edited enough that you were ready to pass it off and have people see it? How much time did you have?
So I signed my book deal with Bookshop in February of 2022. And my first draft was due in early July, which if you have a job that's not full-time and then some freelancing, and you set up a schedule, that's relatively doable. Like I said, I just had I wouldn't have taken it on if I didn't think so. And if my publisher didn't have very good sales reasons for having the two books be released so quickly. But so yes, I had like at most I had 5 months to get it done. It was more practically like 3 to 4 because of the time in which I pitched my second idea and had it approved. And because of that, like I said in my previous interview about noveling, I really appreciate having an open and honest relationship with my editor, because I told her as I was turning it in, I really want us to book in 2 rounds of structural edits on this. I don't feel comfortable or happy with this first draft. And she warned me about what she calls second book-itis. A lot of people go through this feeling because their first book has been polished in one way, shape, or form since they were querying, because you're not going to query something that's slapdash. So you're so used to seeing your work in this polished manner that sometimes you forget how slapdash a first draft can be. But she said, yes, if it will make you feel comfortable, let's do 2 rounds of structural edits. I felt horrible about the draft when I turned it in, felt like I'd failed her. I felt a little bit better after this first pass. And then after the second round of structural edits, I was like, okay, this is a book I'm going to be proud to have my name on. And line edits made it even better because then we could focus on the individual punchlines. And I'm really pleased and a bit relieved to say early readers and those who've bought the book now seem to really be enjoying it. So, it's one of those things where you're like, there's no way that this can happen. But then I remember a totally different kind of writing, but TV writers work on far tighter deadlines than I do. They have to crank out a script a week if they're on a network show. And, sometimes that's the best way to do it. Again, time constraint leading to creativity through pressure.
Yeah. So the idea for this book was not one that you'd been working on for a long time, I take it. Did you have this idea sort of in the back of your mind, or was this something you had to come up with?
I had the vague idea before because, obviously I pitched a few ideas to my editor for the second book. I'd had the idea in my mind for a while that I wanted to write an ensemble cast novel based on my group of friends and our progressive dinner parties. Funnily enough, since your first question really was about setting, I really hadn't nailed down the setting yet. At one point, they were like a jet set bunch and they were trying to figure out if they wanted to keep this very poorly conceived idea of buying a summer house in France that they had all done together. And then I was like, I know nothing about the jet set. This is a horrible setting for this novel. And so gradually the setting became less grand and more relatable to my experience. But the idea had been the idea of this friend group, these different people who were just connected by a previous living space. And the growing pains of friendships and relationships over time had been with me for a little bit.
Well, let's talk about some of the characters. Were any of them based on the friends that you had or people you know or compilations of people you know? Do you draw from people in your life for your characters, or do you create them whole cloth, not trying to think about people you know?
With this particular novel, I think they're more a hodgepodge of people that I know, and they don't resemble necessarily anyone I know, and they're not meant to be simulacra of any particular person. It's more they have shared lived experience with people that I know and love. There are some like fun high points in the novel, like funny scenes that are drawn from the stories that my friends have shared with me. But I don't think any of my friends would be able to pick themselves out of a lineup when they're reading the book.
Your sophomore novel is a rom-com like your first.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like keeping within the same genre? Was it easier because you had spent so much time on the first novel writing within that genre? Was it easier to jump into the second one and to keep that process going? Or are you the kind of writer that likes to kind of jump around and try different things?
It's funny because rom-coms are one of my loves, but they're not my only love when it comes to writing. So, I read pretty broadly as well. I read rom-coms, but I also read like horror novels and memoir. Those are a few of my favorites. And so, funnily enough, one note that I always get from my editor is like, we really need to zoom in on the couple here. And thank goodness for her and those notes, because I think sometimes I really enjoy writing more about the lived experience of our 20s and 30s than I do about romantic relationships. And so luckily she has such an eye for like, hey, we need to close this chapter out with a bit more about what's going to happen to the couple next. So that's been really helpful. I think as far as writing in the genre, it is good that I was already in the headspace of, okay, I'm writing a rom-com, I'm editing a rom-com, because I was editing the first book at the same time I was writing this one, which is an interesting experience. I had really the main way that the two impacted each other is I kept having to check my notes and check my pages and say, I'm not reusing any material from the first book, am I? And no, I wasn't. There were a couple of times I'd sit up at like 3 a.m. and go, oh my God, I think I've used that line before. But then I would go back and check and be like, no, you're conflating the manuscripts at this point in your head.
Well, let's talk about sort of the formula for rom-coms. And it sounds like your editor has been key to help you get that right. Because I imagine there's a fine line between it being just romance with maybe a little comedy or more humor with a little bit of romance. How do you strike the right balance to let it sit squarely within the rom-com genre?
Ooh, that's a really great question, Stacey. I think my ethos for both is I don't necessarily want to go, okay, well, for the formula to work, there needs to be a funny moment here, then we're going to build up to this romantic moment, etc. I more want the romance and the comedy to happen as an influence of plot and of character development. I think that the reader knows when you're being untruthful, regardless of the genre you're writing in. And so I think inserted romance scenes, inserted comedy just for its own sake is pretty obvious to the reader. With that being said, one thing that my editor and I really focused on is that, in this particular second chance romance, we have a couple that in the present day is in the process of separating. So, how are we going to make sure that there's enough romance to sort of do the carrot stick motivation for the reader to keep turning pages? And so that looked like making sure that a flashback scene that has their first little meet cute came in the, exposition. We made sure that the first time, spoiler alert, giving people time to pause. The first time that they kiss again after the separation came at like the very midpoint of the novel. So in that ways, we did try to make sure there was a structure of like, oh, okay, there's enough here that like they could go the distance. We'll see. That really, I think, is an impact, especially in this day of Kindle Unlimited and being paid by the page that people read. I think it's important to not set yourself up for a DNF or did not finish.
You mentioned that you're a fan of rom-coms. Do you draw on sort of the ideas or the feelings that you get from watching movies? Do you try and capture that in your books, or are the movies just something you enjoy separate and apart from what you're writing?
No, I love them, and I do think that I draw from them. In fact, in the first page or two from My Big Fake Wedding, there's an allusion to the rom-coms of the 90s. The main character in my first book gets a phone call and she doesn't recognize the number, but on a whim, she's like, it could be a merry mix-up with a stranger like Tom Hanks in an old Meg Ryan movie. And so she picks up her phone, so there's this nodding wink to, hey, this book knows the genre it's in, and it's working within that a bit. And it's no coincidence that my publisher is riffing off the early 2000s rom-com titles. Like my first book, My Big Fake Wedding, obviously plays with the title My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And then the second one, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days, is obviously, how to lose a guy. God, I'm forgetting the title now. Such a horrible rom-com enthusiast. But the one that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I think that's no coincidence, because they know that this is the kind of rom-com that I'm going towards. And also just the novels that I read, when you're a writer, and I think you can relate to this, Stacey, when you're a writer and you're reading, especially in your genre, you're reading with two minds. You're reading as the reader who wants to be entertained and just have a fun consumer experience, but you're also reading with an eye and an ear out for, ooh, I really like the way that they set this up, or, oh my gosh, that is one way to turn up the heat. I really like that. And I especially am a huge fan. She's recently, I feel like, had a real bump in popularity because of the streaming series, The Flat Share, that's based on one of her novels. But I really love Beth O'Leary. I think we have similar styles and similar ethos when it comes to rom-coms. And so I look to people like her and like Emily Henry for inspiration.
You mentioned favorite rom-com novelists. Any particular books that you really like, or let's even movies that are some of your favorites?
So I think a huge comp for How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days would be Beth O'Leary's The Switch. I was really inspired by that novel when I wrote this. And then let's see, apart from comps, people I really enjoy outside of her, outside of Emily Henry. I actually have to reference one of my, a couple of my Bookshop publishing siblings, Danny Owens Jones, who wrote Stonebroke Heiress. That was her debut. She's hysterical. And then also Sharon Peterson, who wrote The Do-Over, are both just brilliant rom-com writers. And it's been really fun to get to know other authors in the Bookshop family over the course of these two books, and hopefully over more.
Right. Well, and speaking of that, do you want to write more rom-coms? Do you see writing more of these in your future?
If I do, I would really love to write a series. It's been interesting because I didn't have any ideas with series potential when I wrote these. So they're both standalone. You don't have to read My Big Fake Wedding or How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days in any particular order. But I would love to write a series based around like a group of people who volunteer in a community theater. I have a background in Shakespeare acting from college, and I think that could be really fun to play with in a series sort of capacity. And I think one of the things we love about rom-coms is getting to know characters. And if you have the luxury of a series, you can really build those characters out in a way where fans get to know them. And the writer earns the ability to call their readers fans rather than just readers.
Right, right. Well, let your editors know that that sounds really interesting. We would like to see that.
Thank you. I'll be like, Stacey said, come on.
Yes, for all the sway that carries, let them know.
Like a doctor's note. I'll just have you do a permission slip.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Do you have any ambitions towards writing in other genres? Any other things that maybe are on your wish list of things to do as a writer?
I do. Wow. I'm so glad you asked that question. So I have a mostly completed first draft of like I said, it's a first draft, so I'm still figuring out what it is. Bear with me as I describe it. But it's like historical eldritch horror, which is a weird way of describing it. But it's basically the story of a woman who has a hidden past, who drives out to Los Angeles in the late 1950s and cons her way into a practical effects job with a B-movie horror director. And as she sets up her life in LA, things from her past keep bubbling up, especially in her subconscious. So that, like I said, I love horror, and I think for something like that, for anything outside of rom-com, I would really love for that to be where my craft cocktail process is. Rom-com is a genre that's hungry for the next thing. So I'm happy to do high volume there. But for other projects like that, I really want to be able to take my time to explore with theme and what the book is trying to say about particular things. But I already sort of have like my eye on a couple of agents. I've made a list that I'm like, oh my God, I would fangirl if you full requested my manuscript. So
would you write those under a pen name, or would you?
So that's the whole reason that I would even, like, I mentioned an agent. If you recall from our previous conversation, I am unagented and happily unagented with Bookouture. But the reason I would seek out an agent if I wrote in a different genre is because I don't know the answer to that question, whether I should write it under a pen name and basically launch a different brand the way a business might do a DBA or doing business as sort of situation. I really don't know. And so that's why I would love a guiding hand in my corner saying, hey, maybe we do create a different brand for these sorts of books.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have a lot going on. So we'll look forward to all of that.
I've recently said that my writing style is so many books, so little time. It's also my writing style. You should see the size of my TV Red pile right now.
Well, where can people go to find you if they want to learn more about you and the new book and things that are coming up, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, first off, if you are interested in learning more about me, I'm really flattered and I appreciate your interest. You can always go to my website, jessicahatch.com, to get links to my books and news about things that is coming up. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, both places at Jessica in Hatch. That's Jessica in as in novel Hatch. And then my publisher Bookouture manages a newsletter for me. And there should be at this point, there is a free short story you can download that's also a rom-com and sort of indicative of my style if you want to kind of try before you buy. So if you sign up for that newsletter, you should be able to get a free little short story that's about, 20 pages, 30 pages long and should brighten your day.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days and your other novel, My Big Fake Wedding. They can buy those.
Those should be available always on Amazon. My Big Fake Wedding is available in ebook, paperback, and audio. And How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days is available in ebook and paperback. I believe also, if you're interested and so motivated, you can buy paperback copies from bookshop.org if you're in the US. And, if you're interested and you're a library gal or guy, request it for your library. Libraries love to order these sorts of things, and they can order the paperbacks quite easily through Ingram Spark. So yes.
Very good. Well, Jessica, I want to wish you luck with How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days. The
Thank
book,
you.
not anything not anything personal. The
Luckily, I
book.
have a track record of longer than 10 days. So
Excellent. Congratulations. So, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days, your new novel, and we look forward to hearing what you have coming up next. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Oh, thank you so much, Stacy. Take care.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.